Hey guys, what's up? It's Eric with Advanced Level Automotive. Welcome back to the channel. Welcome back to another video. Today, I got something pretty interesting I want to show you. All right, so I know some of you guys might recognize this truck from a video I did a few months ago. If you guys did watch that video, you'll remember that when I had this truck here, I did the AC compressor because the AC was not working. And we also noted that the engine had a pretty big oil leak. However, we didn't really address that concern. Really, the customer's concern was mostly the AC was not working. Now, this truck does belong to a good friend of mine. And like I mentioned in the last video, he is a police officer. And this vehicle is basically used for extra jobs, or what they call EJs. Essentially, police officers, whenever they have time off, they'll oftentimes pick up side jobs, doing things like escorting trailers, escorting funerals, patrolling parking lots, things like that. And so that's pretty much what this truck is used for. So I don't blame him for not wanting to spend a fortune on fixing this vehicle up, because this truck already has well over 230,000 miles. And that does not include the time that he spends idling this engine. A lot of times when he's doing jobs like patrolling parking lots or security, he's sitting in the truck for multiple hours at a time with the engine running. And so even though the vehicle has over 230,000 miles, this engine has way more runtime than your typical daily driven vehicle. But anyway, getting back to my point. So my friend calls me the other day and he tells me that on the way to a job, the truck cut out on him. He heard a really loud bang. And when he got out of the truck, there was oil all underneath it. So he knew something pretty bad had happened. Anyway, so he wanted me to take a look at it. I told him, yeah, go ahead and have it towed over to my garage. I'll check it out. And so one of the first things I did was I removed the bottom cover. And let me show you what I found. I'm just gonna pull this out. Check that out, guys. Damn. Look what I found. That there, ladies and gentlemen, is a piece of connecting rod. This does not belong outside of the engine. Now, if you look over here, you can see there's actually pieces of the engine block that broke away whenever the connecting rod shot out of the side of the block. That is crazy. So obviously this truck is gonna need a replacement engine. Now, as far as rebuilding or repairing the engine that's already in the truck, that's pretty much out of the question, because I'm pretty sure that when we go to pull this thing out, there's probably going to be a big hole in the side of the block. And so this thing is pretty much scrap metal. We need to replace the entire block. Now, rather than going with a brand new engine, which could cost a lot of money, we're going to go ahead and replace it with the junkyard unit for various reasons. Number one, this truck has, like I said, well over 230,000 miles on it. The transmission's not in the best condition. We really don't know how much longer we have with the transmission that's in this truck. Also, this thing needs a lot of suspension work, some electrical work, other things like that. And so it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense to spend a bunch of money to replace the engine only to have the rest of the truck fall apart. So I called around and I found a local salvage yard that does have the engine in stock for a really good price. And so I'm gonna head over there to go pick it up. Then I can start removing this engine, which actually looks pretty easy to remove. It's not a very big engine. It's only a 4-cylinder and there's lots of room under the hood. So this job doesn't look too intimidating. I'm pretty sure we can knock it out in a day's worth of work. That way we can get this thing back on the road, get him back to work so that he can save up to buy something a little better. So I'm gonna head out to the salvage yard, pick up the engine, and I'll be back in a jiffy. All right, guys, so fast forward. I've got the engine. Let me show you. Now, according to the salvage yard, this engine has approximately 87,000 miles on it. And so that's already a pretty good deal, because that's way less miles than the truck already had. Now, if we take a look at it, it looks like it's in pretty good shape. I mean, a lot of the stuff I'm not going to be reusing. I'm going to be taking a lot of stuff from the old motor and moving it over to this motor. Things like the exhaust manifold, the power steering pump, the intake manifold, maybe even the valve cover. And I think I may just go ahead and put a brand new water pump while we're at it, because it looks like it's pretty easy to do while the engine's already out. And so other than that, this engine looks like it's in pretty good shape. I feel pretty confident. So let's go ahead and do this thing. All right, so like I said before, this engine looks pretty easy to remove compared to a lot of other vehicles. For one, we have plenty of space under the hood. Also, this thing's pretty narrow once we remove the intake manifold and the exhaust manifold. So it should be pretty easy to just lift it straight out. I may have to remove the hood, though I'm not so sure of that yet. I guess we'll see what happens once we start lifting the engine up. Anyway, enough talking. I'm gonna get to work, and I'm gonna start by basically removing everything around the engine to give us more space to work with. Things like the air box, the engine computer, the air intake ducting, the coolant overflow jug over here. Then I can start removing the intake manifold. I'll disconnect the hoses, drain the coolant, also drain the engine oil, then disconnect the exhaust. So once we get all that out of the way, we can start unbolting the bell housing bolts from the transmission. Of course, before we do that, we need to remove the flywheel bolts. Now, just to let you guys know, this is not going to be a video that's a step-by-step showing you how to replace the engine in your Jeep. This video is basically just for entertainment purposes. I just like sharing with you guys my experiences. So like I said, enough talking. I got to get to work. crap, guys. I found our hole. Check it out. Peekaboo! Oh man, guys, this hole is gigantic. That is freaking insane. Wow. You can even see inside the crankcase. Take a look. Dang, there's the other half of our connecting rod. Wow, that's crazy. So like I said, this engine block is pretty much useless. It's scrap metal now. So let me finish getting this thing out of here so we can put our junkyard engine in. Crazy. All right, guys, so just a quick explanation as to where I'm at the moment. So first of all, initially I was going to try to remove this bracket here, but it turned out to be a little more difficult than I thought it was. And so I think at this point, I'm going to try to leave this bracket here. I think there is plenty of room for it to come through without it hitting the radiator or the fan. And so I'm gonna go ahead and leave that. And what I went ahead and did was I went down there and I unbolted the compressor and then I just let it hang. So I didn't have to disconnect any AC lines. It seems like the compressor, we can just leave it down there, no problem. The other thing I went ahead and did was I removed the alternator because it did seem to me like the alternator nose, the pulley of it sticks out a little further than the rest of these. And so I wanna make sure I have enough clearance to push the motor forward. That way, when we disconnect the engine from the transmission, we have enough room for the nose of the torque converter to come all the way out of the back of the crank. So at this point, I'm pretty much done here up at the top. I've got the wiring harness completely removed and pushed over to the side. All of the hoses and everything are disconnected. So right now I've got the truck jacked up and on a jack stand. So the next thing I'm planning on doing is removing the flywheel bolts. Now, if you look over here, you can see this is our big crank pulley. Then if you look underneath, there's a little cover right here that goes between the engine and the transmission. Now, if we remove that plastic cover, this should give us access to the flywheel bolts. I can already see one of them right there. And so what I'm gonna do over here is I'm gonna put a ratchet on the crank bolt. That way I can spin the engine. So we'll start by removing this one. I'm gonna spin the crank around. There's the next bolt. Spin it again. Loosen this one. And I believe this one should be the last one. Let me see if I can spin the torque converter freely. Yep, I can move the torque converter freely. That's the last bolt. All right, guys, so let me apologize for fast forwarding, but I pretty much got everything done that I needed to get done underneath the vehicle. I'm sorry I didn't film it, but it was really frustrating working underneath because, again, this thing had a major oil leak, and so there was tons of crap caked all over the bottom of the engine. So I had stuff falling in my eyes. It was really irritating, and quite frankly, there was a lot of cussing going on. However, I do want to take you guys underneath and show you everything I had to unbolt in order for us to remove this engine. So first of all, I had to remove the exhaust bolts, which are basically these 4 nuts on the exhaust flange. Then I had to remove the 3 15mm bolts that hold this bracket for the CV axle to the block. From there, I was able to remove the transmission bolts. There's one right here, one right there, one there, and one up at the top. Also, there's another one here, here, and up here. I did also drain the engine oil, which interestingly enough, I drained over 4 quarts out of this thing. Now that surprised me because initially I thought that maybe this engine threw the connecting rod because it was running low on engine oil. However, that's not the case here. I drained about 4.5 quarts, and that's including the fact that this engine lost a bunch of oil whenever the rod came out of the side of the block. So I'm gonna get the wheel back on, lower this down to the ground, then we can hook up the engine hoist. All right, guys, so this is what the engine bay looks like without the engine. Now, I will say that this is probably one of the more easier ones I've come across as far as the removal and replacement of the engine. For one, we didn't have to remove the transmission. The transmission was able to stay in the truck, and so that did save us a lot of time. Essentially, all we had to do was remove anything that was attached to the engine, like the wiring harness. I disconnected all of the electrical connectors from the engine, and I pushed the wiring harness over to the side. I unbolted the power steering pump. However, I didn't disconnect any lines. I just moved it over to the side. If you look down here, you can see the AC compressor. We didn't have to disconnect any lines. We just left it hanging. Of course, we removed the 4 exhaust nuts in the back. Then, if you look at the CV axle, you can see that we have this bracket here with 3 bolts. Those have to be removed. There are some other miscellaneous things that had to be removed. For one, this little bracket right here bolted up to the exhaust manifold, but it was really easy to remove. There was only 1 bolt. Over here we had the 2 heater hoses. Again, we didn't have to remove them from the firewall. We just had to remove them from the water outlet housing, and there was only 2 clamps holding it on. Then all I did was push the hoses off to the side. The other nice thing is that we didn't have to remove any motor mounts because there's only 1 motor mount holding the engine up on this particular design, and that's the motor mount over here. If you look down at the bottom, we don't have motor mounts here on the frame. The motor mounts are actually on the transmission. So there's a mount back here and there's a mount over here, and they're bolted directly to the transmission. Now, I did have to remove the hood because I did not have enough clearance to actually pull the engine out. If you look up here, you can see I just set the hood up on the roof. It was pretty easy to do. I was able to do it by myself. It's not that heavy, but if you are going to do this, I would recommend having a second person helping you with that. If there's one more tip I can give you guys before putting the motor in, is that you always want to make sure to check and see whether or not your torque converter is fully seated. And so before you go to put the engine in, make sure that you take the time to use your hand and push the torque converter in while spinning it to make sure that it's fully seated up against the transmission. Sometimes the torque converter will actually fall off of the input shaft. You may not realize it because it's still sitting in the bell housing, but then when you've got the motor bolted down, you come down here to put in the torque converter bolts, you'll notice that this torque converter might be jammed up and it won't spin. If this ever happens to you, do not ignore it and don't try to run the engine like that. If you attempt to run the engine with the torque converter binding up against the input shaft, you could potentially destroy the transmission. Now, there are a couple things that I had to do before actually putting this engine into the truck. For one, I had to replace the flywheel. So if you look on the back side, this engine came with a completely different flywheel style, and so I had to remove that one and put this flywheel on there. The other thing that I opted to do while I have the engine out of the truck is to replace the water pump. So if you guys look over here, this is the original water pump. Now, the problem with these water pumps is that by design from the factory, the impeller on the inside of the water pump is actually made out of plastic. And so because it's a lot more difficult to have to do it while it's in the car, it's better to just do it while we have the engine out. Besides, the part is not very expensive. I think this pump was maybe around $40. So if you are doing a job like this, I would totally recommend replacing this water pump while you have the engine out. Real quick, guys, I wanted to show you the difference between the original pump that I pulled off of the engine and the brand new Gates aftermarket water pump that I'm going to be replacing it with. So if you guys take a look here, you can see the impeller on the OEM one is actually made out of plastic. Now, the problem with the plastic impeller is that over time, this impeller will actually come loose from the shaft in the center. And so even though the pump will not leak, it still may have trouble actually pumping the water because this shaft could be spinning and the impeller not spinning with the shaft. Now in this case, this water pump is actually still in pretty good shape. I can move this impeller and it does not move without the shaft moving. So this one was still in pretty good condition. However, like I said, these water pumps are a common failure on these engines, so it's better to just replace it with a high quality aftermarket unit like this one. Again, this one's made by Gates, and if you look at the impeller, you can see it's actually made out of metal. Much more durable. All right, guys, so I've got the engine installed and ready for me to start putting it back together. Now, if there's any piece of advice I could give you, is something I was taught early on when I first started working on cars was to think of the engine and the transmission as two blocks. So if we just picture this battery here as being the transmission and this battery here as being the engine, whenever you're dropping the engine to meet up with the transmission, a lot of times your engine is at an angle. And so what your goal is to try to tilt the engine in order to be in line with the transmission so that they can mate up together. A lot of mechanics fail to understand this basic concept, and they'll spend a lot of time fighting the engine and transmission in order to get them to mesh up together. Sometimes what you'll find is that your transmission is actually hanging downward, and what you need to do is put a floor jack under the transmission to jack it up so that it lines up with the engine. Also, the other thing that you need to do is spin the engine in order to line up the bolt holes for the bell housing. So if you look at the bolt holes on the back of the engine block and you look at the holes on the transmission bell housing, you can determine which way you need to twist the engine in order for them to line up. This is why it's so important to use a load leveling device like the one I used on my engine hoist. This gives you the ability to tilt the engine back and forth so that you can line it up properly with the transmission. Once you're able to get the bolt started in the transmission, you want to make sure that before you actually tighten down any transmission bolts, that the motor is sitting completely flush with the transmission. You really don't want to see any gap between the two. Prematurely tightening a transmission bolt can actually cause binding between the engine and the transmission, and you can actually crack the bell housing as a result. Just a few tips I wanted to add to help you guys out in case you're replacing your engine. Now, the only thing that really gave me a problem on this particular design was the little bracket for the CV axle on the back. You have to make sure that it's tilted at an upward angle so that as you lower the engine, it straightens up and meets up flush against the block. It would help if you had a second person holding the bracket using something like a pry bar while you lower the engine down. In my case, I'm doing this by myself, so it was a little bit tricky, but I was able to get it done. Another tip I'd like to give you guys is once you have the engine bolted up to the transmission, the first thing you want to do is make sure that your torque converter is not binding. Take a look inside the starter hole and you can see our torque converter here. Again, don't get confused, guys. Our ring gear is part of the torque converter on this design. Now what you want to do is make sure that once your engine is bolted up to the transmission, this torque converter should still move freely. So if you guys see me spinning this torque converter, you can see that it moves nice and freely. It is not binding up. And so that lets us know that we installed this properly. Let's go ahead and start putting this thing back together. All right, guys, so let me apologize for fast forwarding, but yesterday the battery in my camera died, and well, I didn't want that to stop me from finishing my work, and so I just had to do what I had to do anyway. I've pretty much got everything put back together here. I put oil in the engine, I've already got coolant, and I'm getting ready to start this thing for the first time. Hopefully this thing starts right up, then we can let it run, bleed out the cooling system, make sure we don't have any leaks, and ship this thing out of here. All right, so I've got the key right here. I'm gonna stick it into the ignition, then we're gonna say a little prayer. Actually, before I try to crank this thing, I'm going to try to prime the fuel pump. So turn it on, turn it back off, put the key, turn it on, cycle it on and off maybe 3 or 4 times. See if we can build up that fuel pressure in the fuel rail. And let's go ahead and try to start this thing. Bam, this thing started right up, check it out. All right, so first of all, you can see over here on the tachometer, the engine is up and running. So far, it sounds pretty smooth. I'm gonna let it run for a little bit, let the idle come down, then we'll take a look under the hood. All right, guys, so after letting this thing idle for a few minutes, so far, it sounds great. There's no knocking, no noise, no exhaust leaks. I mean, I'm really happy with the way this motor is running right now. As you can see, I've got the funnel over here. We are bleeding the coolant system, making sure we get all of the air out. If you look back here, you can see we have a little bit of smoke coming up from the exhaust, but that's from me spraying penetrant fluid on those bolts. Now, the other thing I am happy about is that we don't have any leaks. Now, one thing I didn't mention in the video or film was the replacement of the oil pan gasket. Really, this is just RTV, but I went ahead and I resealed the oil pan gasket because it did look like the original one was leaking, and I didn't want that to cause problems down the road. So again, as you can see, we've got brand new RTV going all the way around this oil pan, and we have absolutely no leaks. Now, the other thing I'd like to mention is that even after running for about 15 minutes or so, we don't have any check engine light. That's definitely a fix.